I saw 200 wagons crowded with wounded men. The dark spot in the mud told all too plainly where some poor fellow's life had dripped out in those dreadful hours. While our soldiers fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them. My place is anywhere between the bullet and the battlefield. Clara Barton, 1863.
In the 4 bloodiest years of this nation's history, the armies of the North and South continuously collided, inflicting horrible carnage never before seen on the North American continent. In its wake, over 600,000 men died, and more than 400,000 injuries were received as a result of the hostilities. 6 million cases of illness were reported in the Union Army alone. At the war's end, nearly 500,000 soldiers returned home with permanent disabilities. The task for caring for these troops were the charge of the Army's medical department, who at the beginning of the war numbered 98 surgeons to 16,000 regular troops. The state's mobilization of regiments permitted the appointment of their own doctors, and in many cases, these appointments were based on political favoritism rather than qualifications.
When the war started, there was about 120 military surgeons in the Federal Army. About 50 of them went to the South, the rest went with the northern states. When each regiment came into the Army, they brought with them their own regimental surgeon. So as each regiment came in, they started with their own regimental surgeon. So as each regiment came in, there were more surgeons. So until there were 12,000 who served in the Union Army and 8,000 in the Confederate Army. Surgeons were trained. Most of them had medical school training, which was about 2.5 to 3 years after a preceptorship. They knew anatomy.
Most of your real experts, really well-renowned doctors, did spend 1 to 3 years in Europe, getting experience and training. Many had to learn a foreign language because the lectures were only given in German or some other language. Your country doctor may or may not have been great. He may not have a license. In fact, over half the doctors in the 1850s did not have any form of bona fide license or specialized training. If a doctor was a good practitioner, he learned the best he could. He learned from his experiences, mostly trial and error, and he passed this on to his apprentice. The medical evaluation of recruits varied very largely from a doctor who watched them parade by and qualified the whole bunch at once, to some doctors who stripped the person naked, which is appropriate, and did a real good physical examination. Later in the war, the doctors were tested in that they know enough to do a physical. They were also graded and reprimanded when they passed too many that had diseases and conditions that existed prior to service. They're supposed to be able to find a man who had a wooden leg, a glass eye, who would not take people with consumption if they could find it out by it. They had a lot of them disqualified for chronic diseases such as syphilis and gonococcal and other venereal infections. They would have to disqualify a man with no teeth. Good reason for this. You had to bite the end of a cartridge off to load your weapon. If you had no teeth, you had to have at least 2 opposable teeth in a position where you could bite the end off the shell. People with false teeth, however, would lose them conveniently. There were false teeth back then. And what you could do is go on in, if you got a battle that you didn't really want to go on, you lose your teeth. Couldn't possibly go to the battle. So they make you a litter bearer probably and make you go anyway. Dentistry was practiced during the Civil War by the surgeon normally, or by a contract dentist. There were no officer dentists, commissioned dentists in the Civil War. The doctor normally was able to pull teeth because that was the last resort. If the teeth was bad, you could pull it out, it wouldn't hurt anymore. He didn't fill any teeth because this was time-consuming, he wasn't that good at it, and he normally didn't have the tools. A contract dentist would come on the post when it was a resting period during the winter, for example, and do some gold fillings, some lead fillings. He would drill with a hand drill. The utensil used to pull teeth actually consisted of a tooth crank. It had a fulcrum, and you twisted and pulled the tooth out. I had some tools also to hold the mouth open, tooth gags, so you wouldn't bite the dentist or the doctor. They had almost like a carpenter's easy out to pull the roots out that left in when they pulled the tooth sometimes. They had various little cleaners and scrapers, like all dentists have, little small tools. But generally it was poor hygiene that got these people in trouble, and lousy food and hard crackers, which would break the enamel sometimes. The area hospitals had surgeons. A surgeon was normally a major. Various numbers. The assistant surgeons who were mainly captains or lieutenants. There were medical cadets, and then you had the medical steward who was in charge of the hospital and the nurses. And well, that varied. Sometimes the surgeon had charge of the nurses, sometimes the medical steward did. The medical steward, who was a senior sergeant in the medical corps, actually he ranked everybody but the first sergeant. He pulled no duties. But many of them were pharmacists and came into the military mainly so that they could practice. The practice varied. In the front lines, they would do some compounding. They would divide up doses from large supplies and put it into the medical pannier, which they carried. The medical knapsack had some medications, mainly blue mass and opium.
The best thing they could do with most of the drugs they carried in these bags was throw it in the ocean. And the only one who would be a bad off would be the fish who would die from it. There were no real curative agents. Quinine probably was a wonder drug. They used it against what they call intermittent fever, which is now we know is malarial type of fever, but quinine was effective against that. They were using bromine against gangrene. It would actually rid the tissue of the so-called bacteria, which they didn't know about at that period of time, but would have some effect against gangrene at that period of time. But that's probably the wonder drugs of that period of time were quinine and bromine.
Quinine actually wasn't used originally for any specific purpose. It was put in medicines, especially patent medicines, because it's extremely bitter. And adult medicine, to be any good at all, has to be strong and adult. Kids' medicine tastes nice, cherry-flavored cough syrup, things like this. So if you could take it on Monday and still taste it on Wednesday, it was great medicine.
Alcohol was, hospital whiskey was probably the most used drug in the Army. It was used as stimulant, and now we know it's a counter stimulant. The men were given that if they did a good job. They had a good battle. The regimental commander would say, give these men so much hospital whiskey or not just whiskey over that night or something like that. They probably fortified the men before a surgical operation by drinking so much whiskey. They administered a lot of the quinine. Quinine doesn't taste very good, so they administered mixed with whiskey sometimes or alcohol.
There was actually a use of a patent medicine by the military. Hochstetter's bitters were actually procured by the Army and passed out to the soldiers. And not widely used, but they were used. Bitters, I should go back and mention, bitters looked like, smelled like, and tasted like whiskey. But they weren't whiskey, they were medicine. When they searched your tent for alcoholic beverages and they confiscated anything they found, they wouldn't confiscate your medicine. So they got smart after a while, poured the whiskey in the bitters bottles, and had no problem. Whiskey was not used for anesthesia. Only in the movies, you'll see this. It was a stimulant in, again, small doses and large doses. It's a depressant. It also adds to blood flow, so that a wound would bleed faster if you were drunk. I tell people that the whiskey was saved for the doctors to keep their hand from shaking. It was too good to give the patients anyway. Heavy metals were used quite frequently. Arsenic in small amounts was used. The big problem was mercury. The very common medication during the Civil War was blue mass. It was taken for constipation, which did happen. Most of the people had diarrhea, but some of them did have constipation, mainly from the morphine they took, or the opium they took, which is highly constipating. Blue mass is a medicine for constipation. It's made largely of chalk and elemental mercury, just rolled up into a little pill. This was used quite frequently, as were other mercury compounds, dovers, powders, some other things contained mercury. And after the war, they found that these people were very irritable. They had some grayish eyeballs and teeth. They had mercury poisoning.
My great-great-great-grandfather, his name was Sara Sites. What we know from his service records is that he did spend some time in a hospital down in the Big Bethel area, the Hampton Roads area, and he was treated for some kind of typhus problem and some kind of intestinal problem. Now, what exactly he was treated with, we don't know, but we do guess that it was probably a mercury-based compound. And when he was discharged from the Civil War and he came back home to the mountain to live, all of his neighbors and his family knew he was never again the same. He went literally insane. And it was only a few short years after his discharge in 1868 that he went to the top of the mountain and hung himself. He went completely crazy as a result of his battle experiences, or possibly that and a combination of his medical treatment. We do know that the uses of mercury applied to his condition, so it is a good guess that that's probably what happened to him. His personality changed so drastically that he wasn't at all the same person. He became very suspicious, very paranoid, even to the point of locking up all of his possessions and taking his guns and threatening to shoot his neighbors if they came around, and even grew very suspicious of his sons and his wife. He would talk to himself, he would go for long walks and not come home, and people wouldn't know where he was. And so he literally, like I said, he went insane. He scared his family to death, and that all culminated in his suicide in 1868.
Opium was used quite frequently, without prescription. Of course, there were few prescriptions back then, for man and child. Paregoric, or laudanum at the time, which is almost like paregoric, it's a tincture of opium in alcohol. It was used frequently. It was the liquid babysitter. You give the child a good dose of that, the child had sweet dreams, didn't bother you all night, and it was quite a teething aid because they could put it on a little rag and chew on it, and it worked pretty well. Other medications were, again, things like quinine, as we mentioned before, was a specific. Digitalis was a specific. There were very few others that really did what they were supposed to do, but generally, the doctors were known sometimes as puke doctors. The term means that the doctors, in their heroic treatment, which is mostly the early part of the century, but persisted to the Civil War, decided that your system, when you had diarrhea or some other intestinal problems, which were very common, you need to be cleaned out. So they would induce vomiting, induce diarrhea, run saline purges, and once you got all that done, they'd bring you back slowly on a light diet, and it worked pretty well. Of course, part of it worked because you didn't want to go through that ritual again.
We're talking about sickness, and to rid the body of this was to purge the body. Whatever you can do to make the person vomit it out, sweat it out, defecate it out, or urinate it out, that's the way you wanted to purge the body of the ill humors that are in the body.
The blockade and relative lack of imported medicines was probably something the Confederate soldier lived better off without. There was a fellow in the Confederate Army by the name of Porcher who was very famous prior to the war and after the war with his use of plants as medicines. Not quite so far-fetched. We still use extracts from plants today for many of our medicines, and it wasn't like we were eating root of blueberry bush or anything like that. They were using plants and extracting alkaloids in solution that were later applied as medicines. Quinine coming from some of the trees in Peru. Willow bark, the extraction of salicylic acid today are very basis for buffer and aspirin, an anti-inflammatory agent used. The opium poppy and the opiate derivatives all were attempted to be grown and extracted by the Confederacy. So it's not like we were eating wild berries or going back to Indian type of medical practices. Modern medicine that used plants as the pharmaceutical source, but that's pretty much accredited to the Confederacy. Confederacy had medical depots where the medicines were actually manufactured or or extracted or made or created or compounded. Columbia, North Carolina, South Carolina was one. Richmond had several of these. The second way that medicines came into the Confederacy was by blockade running. It was a very profitable business, and even though many of the medicines were altered, mostly for the increase in profit for whoever was selling them, they were at least available. Chloroform and many of the opiates came through that way. And then the final way, which is probably fairly common, was the capture of medicines. There's a very famous story of Nathaniel Bedford Forrest capturing $200,000 or $300,000 worth of medicines by capturing a hospital wagon train or a hospital supply train. But every time the Confederates took the field of battle and the Federal Army was retreating, at least in the East, that was a fairly common occurrence, into their hands fell the Federal wounded, but as well their supplies, which the retreating army was not quite as anxious to take with them. Stonewall Jackson's march around Pope's army before the campaign of Second Manassas, he marched right on to the Federal supply trains at Manassas and captured a tremendous number of medical supplies and medicines. So through manufacture on their own, distilleries and whatnot, through blockade running and smuggling through the lines, trading cotton and things, and through capture of federal supplies are the main three ways that the Confederacy got most of their pharmaceuticals and instruments.
Surgeon was normally issued a large operating kit, which had actually all he needed to do was amputation. Little else was in the standard kit. Now, the standard kit was not always carried. Doctors who came in brought their own kits, or bought them after they got in, or were given better kits by the local unit, like the county or state that got up the regiment. And there were instrument makers that were available. George Tiemann was one of the major ones from New York City. He also was given a pocket kit. These little small pocket instruments with tortoiseshell handles had collapsible blades and were used mainly for going tent to tent, area to area to do small things, including small amputations of a finger or something like this. But opening boils, lancing boils in the mouth, there's a gum lancet in there. There's one tool especially made for cutting corns, which were quite common back then. All the things you needed just for a minor practice. Small catheter was normally in the kit. And with those two things, he could do almost anything that the surgeon was required to do during the Civil War. At least the real important things. Now, medications he carried, again, were commonly, there was a medical pannier, there was a medical knapsack, and there were several forms of bulk medicine supplied to the surgeon. He ended up using generally what he liked to use, including some patent medicines, which were his favorites back home, or something he concocted himself and had his medical steward mix up while he was in the field.
Well, there's actually 2 to 1 who died with disease entities. So many disease, probably poor water, poor sanitation, poor food, and the amount of men all gathered together in one camp. There was no immunity. They lived in small areas, and like they weren't exposed to chicken pox. So one man's going to come in with chicken pox. The rest of that camp of 20,000 had no chicken pox. You can imagine what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. The whole camp is going to have chicken pox, and the same thing with measles. Plus, these men were brought from a clean environment. They're home, either in the city or the rural area. Now they're brought to a camp. They don't sleep well. They're gotten up at dawn. They go to sleep late at night. They're sleeping on hard ground. They got mud. They got heat. They got cold. They don't wash effectively. They don't get their clothes cleaned effectively. So they're just an accident waiting to happen disease-wise.
Actually, disease did take 60 to 70% of your soldiers, rather than as opposed to wounds or sabers, gunshots, artillery, whatnot. Especially the young troops early in the war. These people were largely farm people, a few from the city, but I don't know what the percentages were, but the majority were from a farm community. They had been exposed very rarely to childhood diseases. They went to school, maybe, went to school for a short time. They didn't have a neighborhood of other children with diseases to catch things from. So they came in with no antibodies, no immune system, went to a basic training camp with thousands and thousands of others, caught the diseases. These farm kids were fairly healthy, but they died like flies from these communicable diseases. There were also cholera and other diseases that came from bad water, sewage disposal irregularities. Actually, some of them actually died from homesickness. They pined away and died. It was called melancholia, is a medical diagnosis. These were largely young people, young men, more that had just been married, that really missed the home and missed a new wife and just decided it wasn't worth living. But the measles and mumps and chickenpox, mainly the people died of complications. Measles has meningitis, mumps has orchitis. These are all really significant things that you wouldn't see in a childhood disease process, but in an adult you would.
The camps were set up. A man would finish with his food, throw it out the back of the camp, out of his back of his tent. So you can imagine the rodents, the spoilage of food. Latrine facilities were anywhere they could find a place to relieve themselves. A lot of times they had a mass pit, probably upstream of their drinking water. Hammond came in 1863, saw that this was wrong, that sickness is caused by poor sanitation, so he came out with some edicts. Number one, we have a garbage pit. When the men finish with their rations, whatever's not eaten or anything like that is taken to the pit, thrown into that pit, and then every night is covered over with so many inches of dirt. The same thing with latrine or sinks. So many paces away from the camp drinking water. This is where the latrines or sinks were located. They should be about 8 feet deep, and every night so many inches of fresh dirt are put over the material that goes in there that day. And they found out that this was causing the men to be a lot healthier group of men.
The Sanitary Commission did not have much to do with sanitary conditions. That's a misnomer.
Sanitary Commission were a political group of civilians, men and women, doctors, civilian doctors, who saw that they could help the soldiers by providing things that the Army would not provide or didn't have the funds. Basically, they would send them a care package, extra pair of socks, maybe some fruit in a box, things like this. That's something they had. Maybe some envelopes and writing material, something that they couldn't come from the government. What they would do is set up sanitary fairs in all the big cities. People would come to these fairs. They were actually relics that were auctioned off. I think Lincoln had a copy of the Emancipation proclamation that he penned, and he auctioned that off. And this money that the Sanitary Commission would procure, then they would go out and buy these care packages and send these to the troops in the field. The Christian Commission was sort of like that. They dealt more with the soul of the patient rather than the stomach. They provided Bibles, spiritual readings and things like this, conducted prayer services with the men and things like this. So they were an adjunct to what the soldier would get from the government, sort of like, you could call it like the Red Cross of today, maybe.
The sanitary and Christian commissions in the northern armies were political organizations that were organized at a level of the President of the United States. The aid societies that developed in the South were developed on a much more fragmentary basis. Many women in small towns developed aid societies or caring societies or knitting circles and gathered up supplies for the troops and Bibles and knitted socks and foodstuffs and whatnot and sent them off to their soldiers. As well, the South Carolina Bible Society, headed up by Barnwell Rhett, actually stepped into the hospital system recruiting nurses. They recruited women who were well off, who could contribute money, who could pay their way into Virginia or other theaters of war, and actually served as nurses, cooks, laundresses, and helped in the hospitals. Charlottesville was where this fellow set up his main operation, but he actually opened wayside hospitals next to railroads where soldiers who were being transported back to South Carolina could receive bandages and food and Bibles and have letters written for them and things like that. So they did exist in the South, very much so, but it was more of a grassroots type of organization at the state level or at the community level rather than at the national level in Richmond as the counterparts of the Federal Army had.
I'm standing on the Gettysburg battlefield just northwest of the Wheatfield area. The position behind me, this ridge behind me, was held for a while in the afternoon of July 2nd by a portion of the 5th Corps. Surgeons who were detailed to the regiments were usually of two types. One type on the firing line or near the firing line assisted the wounded immediately upon being injured. The second type of surgeon, taken from the regiments, went to a brigade or division level a couple of miles to the rear and set up the field hospitals far away from artillery fire. This particular area we're in now is unique because of all of the hundreds of aid stations and dressing stations that were set up by the regimental surgeons. This particular one is marked today on the Gettysburg battlefield. As I walk over behind this boulder, you can see a plaque that was placed here in honor of one of the surgeons who set up his aid station so close, in fact only about 50 yards from me, behind the firing line, thereby aiding the men much quicker than usual. These men who were taken to this section of ground here would be prepared for transportation by ambulances to the field hospitals.
It was the custom of the assistant surgeons of our brigade to work together for the benefit of mutual help. As the troops advanced, we kept with them and closely scrutinized the locality and searched for places for stations, noting trees, fences, straw, stacks, depressions of the surface, or whatever offered a show of shelter, and especially for gullies, which were the most desirable of all. It was necessary for these stations to be near the engaged men. We shifted our stations when it became necessary to conform to the movements of the fighting line. Our surgical work was unusually very simple, though often there was enough of it to keep us fully and laboriously employed. It consisted chiefly of the application of plaster and bandages and the administration of stimulants and superintending the placing of the badly wounded in the ambulances for transportation to the field hospital. No elaborate surgical procedure was undertaken unless there was urgent necessity for it. Dr. William Taylor, surgeon, Confederate Army.
This Millerstown crossover road, which connected the Emmitsburg Road to the Taneytown Road, was a perfect avenue for wounded soldiers and ambulances to go to the rear, to use to make their way to the rear to the designated field hospitals. Now, right behind me is the old John Weichert farm. The area we're in now, and the farm itself, was used as a collecting point for ambulances of the 5th Corps. The ambulances coming from the field hospitals, crossing over the woods and fields and using whatever roads that were available, made their way to an area like this, which was usually safe, fairly safe, since the firing was going on several hundred yards to my right. At this point, they would wait until the stretcher bearers would bring in their loads of injured men. The men making their way back from the firing line on foot would also come to the ambulance collecting point, and if they were too exhausted or their wounds had gotten worse and couldn't make it to the rear on foot, they would wait for transportation to the field hospitals. Now, the field hospitals are located a mile or two even further to the rear. That's why the ambulances were necessary to transport the wounded.
Early in the war, there was a two-wheeler that had no springs and made the patient worse, especially if he had a broken arm or something. And it killed more people than it was good for. The only thing it was really good for was an officer's Surrey type thing to ride around in. Four-wheel Rucker ambulance was much better, but still not that great.
In the wagons were men wounded and mutilated in every conceivable way. Some had their legs shattered by a shell or a mini ball. Some were shot through the bodies. Others had arms torn to shreds. Some had received a ball in the face, or a jagged piece of shell had lacerated their heads. Scarcely 1 in 100 had received adequate surgical aid. Many of them had without food for 36 hours. Their ragged, bloody, and dirty clothes, all clotted and hardened with blood, were rasping the tender, inflamed lips of the gaping wounds. Very few of the wagons had even straw in them, and all were without springs. The road was very rough and rocky. The jolting was enough to have killed sound strong men. From nearly every wagon, as the horses trotted on, such cries and shrieks as these greeted the ear. Oh God, why can't I die? My God, will no one have mercy and kill me and end my misery? Oh, stop 1 minute and take me out and leave me to die on the roadside. I'm dying, I'm dying. My poor wife, my dear children, what will become of you? Some were praying, others were uttering the most fearful oaths and execrations that despair could wring from their agony. Occasionally, a wagon would be passed from which only low, deep moans and sobs could be heard. No help could be rendered to any of these sufferers. On and on, we must move on. General John D. Bowden, Confederate States Cavalry on the retreat from Gettysburg, July 1863.
I'm standing next to the George and Elizabeth Spangler barn here in the 11th Corps Hospital near the Gettysburg battlefield. Interesting that these boards on the barn, as well as the doors and most of the structure itself is original from 1863. In fact, often the surgeons would remove the doors, the smaller doors, and use them for operating tables. The larger doors were open, allowing ambulances to come up the ramp here on this bank barn, as it was called, because they were built into a bank. And the ambulances could then deposit their loads of injured men on the threshing floor here on the second floor of the barn. Down below where the stalls were would also become filled with wounded. There is a misconception though, because many people think that all of the wounded were always deposited, the entire numbers of wounded in churches or schools or barns or farmhouses. That's not true. The vast majority, the greatest number of wounded were transported to areas like this and then laid out in the open. And these field hospitals, this 11th Corps hospital, would have been separated by divisions. The Union Corps hospitals were usually broken up into divisions. You might have the 1st Division over here on a hill to the right, and their tents would be set up out here. Maybe the 2nd Division would be around the farm itself. In other words, the barn, the house, the other outbuildings, the summer kitchen, and then maybe the 3rd Division would be over here in a wooded area on the same farm. That way, all supplies could come into this area, into one area, and be distributed to the 3 division hospitals, and all of the wounded that would come from the 11th Corps would go immediately to their own divisions. One of the reasons the soldiers wore Corps badges was to be able to identify them as to their particular division and immediately transport them there. The ambulances coming from the front lines, from the collecting points, and the aid stations would come back the quickest way possible, sometimes through the open fields and sometimes along roads to an area like this to deposit their wounded. The ambulances were going to and fro from the front constantly for even as long as 4 or 5 days after the battle, still searching for wounded. It's interesting that the 5th Corps mentions that it had all of its wounded picked up off the field and deposited at the hospitals in a matter of about 24 hours. Sometimes it took a little longer, depending on the conditions, the weather, the terrain, and the amount of fighting going on still at the front.
Was laid on the threshing floor of the barn used for a hospital near the big door. There I had a fine view of the bursting shells coming in every direction. There was at one time 6 explosions of shells in one moment. The danger of becoming so great that every man was removed except myself and an old German. The surgeon who had been in shortly looking at my wound ran for his life. As he passed the door, he called, "Get out of there as soon as you can," knowing that I could not move. He soon sent 2 men to carry me away. They placed me in the lower part of the barn, in a building called the Wagon Shed. This place was occupied mostly by wounded rebels. S.C. Romig, 153rd Pennsylvania, at the 11th Corps Hospital, Gettysburg.
Surgery was quite good, the instrumentation was quite good. The problem was there was no sterilization of anything. We start with the surgeon's hands, down to the bandage material to the instruments themselves. There was no knowledge of sterility in 1861 to 65. That knowledge didn't come to mankind until 1869, 1870, when Pasteur in France and Lister in England started finding that there are bacteria. This is what causes the disease, and this is what you can do by cleaning these instruments and cut down on this problem. It wasn't until probably the 1880s, it took 15 years for this actually to percolate into the minds of the surgeons. Lister was laughed out of a medical amphitheater where he gave this theory, and they actually laughed him out of there. But it took a while for this theory to sink in.
The average person would get a wound from a mini ball. Mini ball is a conical, heavy caliber lead bullet which tumbled. It didn't necessarily go straight. Or from a round ball up to 69 and bigger caliber, which were large pieces of lead. These were in a cartridge. The cartridge was a paper one, and as part of the loading procedure, you had to bite the bullet off, keep it in your mouth while you poured the powder down the gun. Then put the wadding in, and then insert the bullet and push it down. This contaminates the bullet completely because your mouth is a very good source of contamination, saliva. The bullet was fired from the gun and did not move fast enough for friction to do any good. Modern day weapons go fast enough so that the heat of friction, of passage, can possibly sterilize it. Now this is questionable. But it did reach the person going slowly, tumbling, and contaminated. It then went through several layers of clothing frequently. This clothing had not been washed normally. People were told to change their clothes. Well, Ernie would change with George, and George would change with Louis. They wouldn't wash that much because normally they had only one set of everything. Carrying extra clothing was heavy and got in the way. Underclothing and things like that were used for patches, for cleaning guns with. And generally it was filthy and was carried into the wound by the bullet. Now, the bullet also then, say, hit a bone, a large bone in your leg. It would shatter the bone. It would not go through, it would not make a small laceration. It would completely shatter it. Fragments would be scattered all over the wound. And it was impossible at the time for the orthopedic practice to put that bone together.
The joint resection question is one that comes up frequently. America, during the war period, was not used to seeing the tremendous number of casualties that were generated from the accuracy of the weapons. And the only treatment that we had was this amputation business, that separating the man from the diseased part. That didn't bode well with popular thought, and there were many, many accusations, perhaps some rightly so, that we had surgery-happy doctors who would take off a man's limb to perfect their skills. And probably nothing could be farther from the truth because of the tremendous mortality that came from doing this procedure. As part of a reaction to that, and part of a conservatism that spread throughout the Federal Army and the Confederate Army as the war progressed in 1862, 3, and 4, attempts were made to resect or to remove that diseased portion of tissue and join or allow some type of a natural joint to form at a place where it wouldn't normally be and save the limb. Not having a fully functional limb, but at least having a limb. This turned out to probably be more of a bust than a bone. Initially, people were happy because they had their arm back, but just like in today's society, with nerve damage, with blood vessel damage, with eventual scarring down of tissue, these men developed very painful, very loose, useless limbs. The idea of phantom limb pain, or what we now today know as reflex sympathetic dystrophy, or any of the pain syndromes were very, very common in these men. In the 1870s, a lot of men who had resections returned to the Army surgeons asking that they go ahead and have this arm removed. It was simply a useless appendage that hurt all the time. And resection started to fall by the wayside. As time went on and surgery developed in the Listerian era, it became a totally different story, but we didn't have the pus formation and the scarring and those kinds of things, and we had lots of time to kind of manipulate tissue. These resection operations were done under very, very primitive conditions, very quickly. We didn't have the ability to re-anastomose blood vessels or nerves or anything like that, and so the result was, yes, living tissue, but not functioning living tissue.
Soldier was brought in. wound, say we'll take a wound lower leg below the knee. He's brought into a surgical theater, operating table, which is probably a kitchen table, a door that's laid over some barrels, anything to support the weight of a man. The surgeon would come in, examine that wound. He would make the decision whether the arm or the leg, we're talking about the lower leg right now, it would have to come off or not. He would have an operating surgeon do this. This operating surgeon would have the availability of assistants.
Amputations, in general, were the most common form of treatment during the Civil War, mainly because that was the most important thing to do to save a life. This needed to be probed to see where the bullet was, if it had hit the bone, if it was still in there, this type of thing. There were various types of probes. The finger was the most used. It wasn't the cleanest, but it did have the property of being able to feel something down there. Now, mainly they were trying to figure out if it was a bullet or if it was maybe a bone fragment. There was another probe developed for this specific purpose called the latence probe, N-E-L-A-T-O-N. This had a porcelain tip. The porcelain, when rubbed against lead, turns black. So you determined that the bullet was still in there. Well, many times they didn't remove a bullet. If it wasn't in the way, if it wasn't just under the skin where you could easily pop it out, it wasn't doing any damage near a large blood vessel or something like this, it would stay there. And people carried fairly large numbers of bullets to their grave, 10, 15, 20 years after the Civil War.
One of the misconceptions of medicine in the Civil War is that the soldiers' operations, especially you hear about so many amputations, were done without any kind of medication. This is not true. Probably 95% or more of operations were done with either chloroform or ether. The soldier was put to sleep and the operation was then completed. That old story of the soldier biting the bullet in pain and suffering through an operation by biting on a lead bullet is not true. First of all, it wouldn't be good medical practice because it was too easy for someone to swallow something like that. If they were going to use anything, while they were probing, which they often did, they probed the wound before they gave the chloroform. The soldier would be biting down on a leather strap or something that could be controlled rather than a bullet that could be swallowed. The soldiers who were being checked out by the surgeons prior to the operation were being checked out because the surgeon sometimes didn't quite know how he was going to handle each operation. For instance, if he found many bone fragments or the projectile itself had split into parts, it might be more complicated than just a flesh wound. So the surgeons often probed with their fingers right through the wound, the entrance sometimes and the exit wound, finding out if there's anything loose in there and see if he could feel the bullet or the projectile or the shell fragment, and he could remove it with his fingers. This was often done without any type of medication given. But once an operation was determined had to be made, then the soldier was put under, usually by chloroform. And the chloroform was poured into a handkerchief or sometimes a cow's horn stuffed with cotton or an inhaler. They had some instruments called inhalers which were made for that purpose. And the soldier was soon asleep and the operation was completed within 10 or 15 minutes.
First assistant would administer the anesthetic. If chloroform was used or ether, they had a tin type of funnel with muslin in time. They'd put this over the man's nose. The anesthetic would be dripped into this. The man would be told to breathe in, and in about 3 to 4 minutes of breathing in the anesthetic agent, the man would be surgically asleep. Then the wound would be probed again. The principal probe was the surgeon's finger. He would locate where the problem was. They would apply a tourniquet to shut the blood supply to that area. Then they would start incising first through the skin, then through the muscle tissue, and then get the arteries out of the way, ligate the arteries, the main arteries, so the man won't bleed to death, saw through the bone, and then bandage the wound.
He wouldn't amputate if he didn't have to. If there was some chance it would survive, he wouldn't amputate because he had plenty of other guys that wouldn't survive, that he had to do. So the old myth about cutting everything off just in case it might get bad is not correct. They just didn't have the time. Some of the niceties were sometimes left out, mainly because there were just too darn many. You were sitting there with 40 or 50 guys waiting for amputations. It was starting to get dark. It was more difficult to operate, although possible after dark. And you'd been working for 2 days straight with no sleep. So you did what was called a guillotine amputation. This is a simple one. You simply make a round cut clear around the limb, sufficiently above the injury so that you felt the tissue was good. It wasn't part of the injury site. You would pull the skin back toward the body as far as you could, and you would cut the muscle from the bone. You would again pull that back as far as you could and cut the bone. So that when you pulled all these things back down, you had a covering over the bone so it wasn't sticking out where it would be wear right through actually when you had a prosthesis. You would kind of clip off the bone ends a little bit so you rounded it off a little bit instead of being sharp. You would pull it back down and suture it. Suturing was done very loosely because they wanted to allow for drainage. The ends of the sutures, especially on large blood vessels, were left hanging free. The large blood vessels were ligated. Cautery was used very seldom during the Civil War. Previous to that, this was used, but the problem is it formed a large scar and a scab, fell off, and started the bleeding all over again. This way, the large ligatures, or sutures that you used to close off the blood vessels, were left hanging out, and a week or so later, they were pulled on gently, because normally the end would rot off, the blood vessel would seal itself, and you could remove them. If you were unlucky, you'd pull one, and it would start bleeding again. You have to go back in and re-ligate the blood vessel, which was not a good practice. The mortality was high.
The man would then be brought out of the anesthesia and sent into a hospital environment. Time-wise, it probably would take eight minutes maximum. Surgeon would say next, the next, because they had 1,000 casualties to take care of. Surgeons worked for 72 straight hours. In fact, they worked themselves so they couldn't even stand up anymore. Some of them actually worked themselves till they went blind, temporary blindness, and they just had to quit. But that was the next. Every time something happened, they'd wash. I don't think they'd wash the table down. They'd just get rid of the man they had on there, put him away into a hospital environment, and bring in the next one. And that went on day and night.
During the war, they would run out of normal black silk ligatures and sutures, and with nothing else, they finally decided to use horsehair. Well, horsehair is very difficult to work with. It's stiff and hard to tie knots in, unless you boil it. When you boil it, it comes out about like spaghetti, nice and loose and easy to tie, and that just accidentally sterilized it. He had the theory of laudable pus. If a wound got very yellow with pus and weeped a lot, that was healing. They found actually that wasn't quite right later on, and it wasn't very laudable. It came mainly from dirty hands and dirty instruments.
Maggots, there's questions asked always about maggots. Were they introduced? I think they were introduced. I know there were accounts of introducing maggots into flesh, gangrenous wounds, and the maggots actually only eat the dead flesh. And then the maggots were washed away with either a chloroform or alcohol content. Some of the wound probably would nick or puncture into the colon or the intestines, which would cause intense infection, which they had no way to fight at that period of time. So most of the abdominal wounds, the thorax wounds, or the chest, and then the head wounds were probably left away. Men were given painkillers, and hopefully that they would die uneventful, quick death.
A man laying upon the ground asked for a drink. I stooped to give it, and having raised him with my right hand, was holding the cup to his lips with my left, when I felt a sudden twitch of the loose sleeve of my dress. The poor fellow sprang from my hands and fell back quivering in the agonies of death. A ball had passed between my body and the right arm which supported him, cutting through the sleeve and passing through his chest from shoulder to shoulder. Clara Barton at Antietam Battlefield, September 1862.
The nursing profession got started in the Civil War. The first nurses that came forward were the Catholic Sisters of Charity. These are Catholic sisters, are unmarried women. They saw a need. They asked the United States government if they could come in and fulfill the need, and they did this. They came in and staffed the hospitals. Then a nursing corps was set up in the Union Army. Dorothea Dix was head of that. She would actually, and her counterparts, would interview women who wanted to become nurses. Most of these had relatives in the war, maybe a husband. That's where Mrs. Bickerdike came in. Her husband was wounded in the war, died, and she came in and helped nursing, and she stayed on, and then she became one of the famous nurses of the Western Theater because she became very friendly with General Grant and General Sherman. So actually, they put her in charge of these hospitals. And the same thing with Dorothea Dix out east. She had some different ideas of who could become a nurse. If you were a very nice-looking lady, probably she wouldn't accept you. You had to dress very plainly. You had to dress in black and gray, and you had to be buttoned from the neck all the way down, and very stringent rules of what nurses could and could not do. And she probably didn't let some very well-qualified people in, or women in, because they might have looked very nice. So this was the start of the Army Nurse Corps, or the nursing profession as we know it today, and also on the southern side.
The Army frowned upon women in that role, and so the nursing role actually fell to the steward and to the ward matron and to the nurse, which was either a convalescing soldier or some other band member or somebody who was to take care of the wounded, meaning to change the bandages and wash them and those types of things. Initially, women who were nurses were employed by both the Federal and the Confederate Army in the role of spirit uplifters, perhaps feeding soldiers, reading to them, writing letters, bringing them clean linens, helping the laundresses launder things, but not dressing wounds, repacking wounds, the types of nursing things, passing out medications that we see today.
The hollow behind me was a cornfield at the time of the battle, and it's here that Clara Barton came on the field around 10 o'clock in the morning with her 2 wagons filled with medicinal supplies and medicinal brandy. On the morning of September 17, 1862, Clara Barton arrived here with a couple of wagons filled with medicinal supplies, which the surgeons desperately needed. By then they were using corn leaves to treat the men's wounds because they had run out of bandages. She found over 300 casualties in the farmyard, and near the barn door behind me, she took a bullet from a man's jaw with a pocket knife without using anesthesia. It was here in the farmyard, while she was giving a wounded man water, that a bullet passed through his shoulders and through her right sleeve. She never patched a dress in honor of the dead soldier's memory. On the night of September 17, 1862, the Sherrick House and the auto house across the road from us became the picket outpost for the 21st Massachusetts, which had been involved in the fighting down at Burnside Bridge. Clara Barton showed up on the picket line and treated the wounded between the lines. The men of the 21st were so taken with her that they adopted her and made her part of the regiment, and she was invited to all the reunions after the war.
As the first day battle progressed, the town of Gettysburg very quickly filled up with wounded soldiers. All of the public buildings were converted rapidly to hospitals to take care of these soldiers. Also, the private homes were pressed into service. In the beginning, these homes were primarily used as cookhouses to prepare some kind of meals for these soldiers, to boil linens, to take general care of the immediate needs of these soldiers. But on the morning of the second day, a Dr. James Fulton with the 143rd Pennsylvania, who was in charge of the field hospital at the Catholic Church on High Street, very close by to where Sally lived, came down to their house, and he asked for much more than that. He walked in and he said to Sally herself, he said, "Please, you've got to come and help our soldiers. They are in desperate need of attention, and we do not have enough hands." Sally's response to that in the beginning was fear. She was just not sure that she would be able to handle that kind of a task, because she had said earlier on that the thought of blood and the sight of blood always intimidated her and made her very afraid. But she then said to herself, what choice did she really have? She knew that these soldiers who were suffering in the hospitals did need her help. So she overcame her fears, and she walked up to the Catholic Church on that second day. And her memoirs and diaries record a very poignant story in connection with that. As she walked up High Street and up the steps of the Catholic Church, she went inside to the vestibule and she knelt down beside the first soldier that she saw lying there. And she said to him, she said, "What can I do for you?" And he looked at her and he said, "Nothing. I am going to die." And she wrote about how horribly that affected her. She felt overcome and overwhelmed by emotion from his response. And she didn't quite know what to say to him. So she turned around, walked back out of the Catholic Church, sat down on the steps and cried. She just put her head in her hands and she cried and she sobbed. And after a while, she collected herself and she went back in and she spoke to him again. And his name was Sergeant Alexander Stewart, and he was with the 149th Pennsylvania, part of the Bucktail Brigade that was involved in the pretty serious fighting of the first day out on McPherson's Ridge. Alexander was one of the soldiers who she brought into her home and later nursed. She took care of him for 6 days, and he died in her arms on July 6th. She also talked about her house being so overrun that she did not have a bed to sleep in. She actually slept in her clothes for days on end, just in a little corner of her upstairs hallway. Sally Myers also narrowly escaped the fate of Jenny Wade during her nursing experiences. She talked about holding Alexander in her arms through the night one night, and the shelling was going on, so this must have been probably July 3rd. And she related how the whole family had again been ordered to the cellar. They were supposed to go to the cover and the safety of their cellars, but she was afraid to leave Alexander. She didn't just want to let him lie there unprotected and uncared for, and he was too weak and too injured to be moved, so she stayed with him and she held him, and she relates how she got very uncomfortable doing that. She was in one position and I suppose she started to ache, and so she shifted her position, and just as she did, a bullet came in through the one window and landed exactly where she had been sitting right before she moved. Had she not moved, she very likely could have been killed, or at least injured pretty badly.
After the war, the Union, probably the first, what we call the forerunner of the Veterans Administration, was set up. Soldiers who had a need of the prosthesis were given money to go to a prosthesis company. The prostheses were being made. Some of them were good, some of them were crudely made, and some of them were a little better. Some had hinges on them. The main thing for a prosthesis wasn't so much the prosthesis as how the surgery was done. If the surgeon did a good job in preparing the stump, meaning there would be enough tissue between the bone and the outer edges of that stump where it would be a good cushion, then the man would have probably a very good prosthesis. The problem is if that bone was very close to the surface, then he'd probably always going to have a painful type of prosthesis development.
The articulations weren't that good. As far as swinging the leg, they were normally stiff. The joints weren't locking joints like we have nowadays, although there were some. It was quite common to have strapped on arm or leg. They kept saying that the man would go to church, he'd put in his false teeth, his glass eye, hook his prosthetic arm on, and be ready for Sunday. The rest of the week he wouldn't wear them. If they tried and had a good prosthesis, some of them were very ingenious and did work quite well. Eyes, they did have, again, a cosmetic type glass eyeball. Glass eye prosthesis, I should say. These were mostly made in Europe, in Germany. They were made of glass, as I say. They were not round balls like marbles. The actual pit that was left when you lost an eye has scar tissue at the bottom of it, is not perfectly round. And these are almost like a very thick contact lens, where you put a small pudget, normally greased up with some petroleum jelly or something in there, and slip the eye in between the eyelids. They were varied in that some of them had, well, it was supposed to match the other eye. Some people's eyes were bloodshot. They used small red threads in the glass to make the blood vessels. Some people had a little yellow jaundice, which shows in the eyes. Some of the eyes were yellowish. Most of the eyes were blue because most Germans have blue eyes.
Surgeon General Hammond saw the need and the ability to really learn from these documented specimens. Keep in mind they didn't have X-ray technology, they didn't have the modern imaging techniques we have today. So in order to really understand what the mechanism of fracture was or the mechanism of healing, they had to look at an actual specimen. They didn't have an X-ray or even good photographs at the time. So by studying these specimens with physicians, pathologists, they could further the state of medical care during and after the war. The skeletal specimens were by and large sent here in barrels filled with alcohol, whiskey, rum, what have you, Some of the legends, of course, show that these barrels were tapped during their course of transport here to Washington, and materials drunk by the soldiers on the way. I'm not sure if that's true or not. Once they arrived here, the usual method was to boil them, first remove the heavy-duty outer tissues, and then boil them down to remove the flesh that was closer to the bone. Then the specimens, or the parts of the specimens that were not affected by the shot fracture or the infection, were discarded, and only the affected piece kept and documented. After the war, the surgeons put together a series of volumes called the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion. And these volumes document just about every case of disease and injury on the Union side, and some of the Confederates as well. It talks about the outcomes of the different treatments, the outcomes of the different amputation techniques. And these volumes really helped to change the face of military medicine and civilian medicine after the war.
Surgeon General's Office, Army Medical Museum. Case of Private Roland Ward, Company E, 4th New York Artillery. Aged 46, was wounded at Ream Station, August 25, 1864, by a fragment of shell. On January 20, 1865, an operation was performed to construct a floor for the mouth. No anesthesia was used. On April 22, 1865, the parts being in favorable condition, ether was administered and a second operation was performed. 2 incisions, one to the right and one to the left, parallel to the inferior border of the inferior maxillary bone, each 3 inches in length, severing both the facial arteries which were secured by ligatures. Major H.A. Barnum, 12th New York, was wounded at Malvern Hill, July 1, 1862, by a conical musket ball. The wound was regarded as fatal, and the patient was left in a field hospital. On July 2nd, he was captured and taken to Libby Prison, a distance of 18 miles, in an express wagon. On July 17th, he was taken to Aiken's Landing in an ambulance, a distance of 17 miles, and exchanged. Promoted to the command of the 149th New York, Colonel Barnum took to the field January 1863. The colonel resumed his duties and commanded his regiment at Gettysburg. Promoted to be a brigade commander, General Barnum was almost continually in the field for the next 2 years. He participated in the campaigns of Atlanta, Georgia, and Carolina, and was shot through the right forearm at Kennesaw Mountain and received a shell wound of the side at Peachtree Creek. Since the close of the war, General Barnum has enjoyed comparatively good health and has actively participated in political affairs. Private Edson D. Bemis, Company K, 12th Massachusetts, was wounded at Antietam by a musket ball which fractured the shaft of his left humerus. The fracture united kindly with very slight angular displacement and a 1/4 inch shortening. Promoted to be corporal, Bemis received, May 6, 1864, at the Battle of the Wilderness, a wound from a musket ball in the right iliac fossa. 8 months after the injury, Bemis returned to duty with his regiment. On February 5, 1865, Corporal Bemis was again severely wounded at the engagement at Hatcher's Run near Petersburg. A musket ball fractured the squamous portion of the left temporal bone, and the patient states that the surgeons found it lodged in the substance of the left cerebral hemisphere, whence it was extracted, together with several fragments of bone, on February 8, 1865. There was a slight discharge of healthy pus from one point. The pulsations of the brain could be felt and seen under the integument. The mental and sensory faculties were unimpaired.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.